let's say, several years. Like Christina said, I was her student, let's call it the mid 2000s at UE, and one of actually the first group of tourism management students at Cave Hill. And so it's exciting to kind of reconnect and to be on this side of the classroom. So I'm really excited to start. I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and you guys can tell me when you're seeing it. Okay.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah. You can see the presentation screen?
I can see it. Students, could you let us know if you can see it? Just raise your hand or something for us. All right, I'm seeing some hands there and thumbs up. So we're good, Veronica.
Okay, good. You're seeing it in full screen mode, right?
No, I still see the banner on top. It's not full screen.
All right, let me just make sure. Can you see it now?
Yeah, now it's full screen. Nice. Thank you.
Okay. All righty, great. This over here. Good. So we're all set. So let me go to the beginning. So yes, welcome. Like I said, I worked in tourism for several years, for actually about 12 years in the hospitality and accommodation sector initially, and then for over 5 years in the attraction sector. I was the marketing manager for Harrison's Cave for over 5 years, and that was at a pivotal time in the life cycle of the attraction. It was during our redevelopment and relaunch of the entire product. So it's really relevant to the concept of attractions management and development, because I was able to kind of get in at the ground floor of completing a redevelopment project and then relaunching a mature tourism product back into the market as a new refreshed product with a new suite of products and so on. So let's go. Are you seeing the slides progressing? Just want to make sure.
Veronica, it's actually stuck on intro to attractions and it's not full screen anymore.
God.
Something happened there when you switched something and then it ended up here. So we're on page, I believe this is slide 2, it says.
Okay.
That's the first one with a picture, an image of Harrison's Cave. Yeah. Slide
Okay.
now is full screen.
Okay, great.
You want to forward so I can let you know if it's working there? I mean, move to the next one. Not, yeah, intro to attractions is what I can see now.
Okay, we're at the right slide.
All right, great.
Okay, perfection. All righty. So today I'll just be chatting around the natural visitor attractions, management and development, specifically the case of Harrison's Cave. I'll also be talking about what happens when, best case, you do great sustainable tourism management and planning for attractions, and then the use cases where sometimes that goes wrong. And even when you have the best of intentions, it kind of goes sideways sometimes. So let's get into it. So one of the major, and first, let me start by saying, I want this session to be interactive. So there'll be different points within the presentation that I'm going to be stopping and asking you guys questions. So feel free to either raise your hands or hop in when I ask a question. And so we have the session a little more interactive. So one of the USPs of most destinations is obviously visitor attractions. And it is a major differentiator between destinations. So when you look at destinations within the Caribbean region, sea, sand, and sun destinations that we are compared to, like the Maldives and other areas in the Pacific, the attractions at the destination after accommodation and food are probably the next largest driver within the destination. There are various types of tourism products. You have cultural tourism and event tourism, ecotourism, adventure tourism. And along with each type of tourism is often a focus on a specific type of visitor attraction that's central to it. So on screen, we have the Great Wall of China and the Eiffel Tower in Paris. Does anyone, or would anyone like to share any example that they can think of an attraction that kind of exemplifies, say, cultural tourism, event tourism, sports tourism, or any of the others listed there? We just had a couple in Barbados, but you can share not just relevant to Barbados, but relevant to the region or anywhere else.
All right, you all know this because we've gone through this for weeks now. So just give some examples there.
Yeah, I'll give an example of event slash cultural. So we just had the food and rum festival in Barbados. That is an example of an event attraction experience, a culinary experience. There are people who are huge foodies and food bloggers and travel bloggers who travel throughout the world just to have Epicurean adventures. And so the attraction for them is the Epicurean event. So that's an example of, say, an event tourism type attraction. And of course, I'm sure you can guess what an attraction specific to ecotourism or adventure tourism or sports tourism will be. We have a big one coming up in the next 2 years in the Caribbean with relevance to sports tourism. What would that attraction be? Can anybody guess?
There is a hand. Oh, Shanice,
Yes.
raise your hand. You can, Shanice?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, sorry. Yes, Christine.
Okay.
I had an example. Hi, Veronica. Let me make sure I got it right. Yeah, Veronica. I had an example, but not to the question that you actually just asked just now. So you want me to give that still, or?
Are you asking Veronica a question?
Ma'am, can you hear me?
I'm not even seeing her anymore. Veronica?
Hi.
There you are.
Yeah. Second there, everything froze.
Okay.
Hello.
Yeah.
Ma'am, can you guys hear me?
I can hear
Yes,
you.
I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Right. So you remember just now you had asked us to give an example out of the above that you have mentioned. So my example was a combination of event tourism and sports tourism regarding the Olympic Games.
Yes.
Like, for example, the one in 2020 that was in Tokyo, and then the one in next year, 2024, is in Paris.
Yes.
So that was my example.
Yeah, that's perfect. And in the region, we have Cricket World Cup coming to the Caribbean in the next, I think, 2 years, or is it 3 years? So yeah, the Olympics is a great example. It's a very good, actually, it's a very good case study of what an attraction can be positively or negatively, depending on how it's developed. There are a lot of case studies out there about the Olympics and its impact on the community wherever it's been. So yes, that's a great example. So we're going to get into some of the differences, specifically the characteristics around natural attractions versus man-made attractions. And so like I said earlier, some of the man-made ones would be stuff like the Eiffel Tower, Disney, and other attractions like that. And then natural attractions, some examples would be Harrison's Cave, the Seven Wonders of the World, and those kinds of things. So it's broken down into four main categories. The origin, how did this attraction originate? Its popularity and why. The environmental impact of the area that it's in, and then of course, sustainability. So with natural attractions, you can see that they're created by nature, whereas man-made or created by man. The popularity for natural attractions is that they're incredibly beautiful or unique wonders of the world, whereas man-made attractions are typically popular for education or entertainment purposes, or for unique experiences. In terms of the environmental impact, for the most part, the creation or the origin of a natural attraction is minimally impacted because it exists in nature, and nature tends to strike its own balance. It's when we get involved that the balance goes a little off. So you see the difference in environmental impact with the development of a natural attraction, but at its base, it's minimally impactful. However, with man-made attractions, the level of the environmental impact is strictly determined by the ethos of the attraction and its development company. And then, of course, sustainability. For natural attractions, this can be managed significantly with great planning and focus on sustainability. The impact can be minimized. And similarly, it can be done in the man-made attractions as well. So the significance of attractions. So landmarks like the Taj Mahal and Great Wall of China, they're considered iconic. So in themselves, they are attractions. And so some people would argue that the destination might be China and the attraction is the Great Wall of China. But when it comes to your motivation for travel, what was the motivation? Was the motivation the destination or the attraction? And then does that make the attraction itself the destination, right? So many people go to these areas because of that specific attraction, and that makes them the direct driver, and they contribute to the growth of tourism in that area. Attractions significantly increase or contribute to tourism spend. For instance, in Barbados, cruise tourism spend on average, and this may be slightly dated information, was around $60 a day, $70 a day. And it's usually lower than long stay tourism because obviously they're here one day and they have food on the ship. But a significant, almost 70 to 80% of that is sheer attractions spend. The other 10 to 30% is usually transportation spend. Lives and livelihoods of communities. Attractions are significant because they offer the opportunity to either enhance a community or in some cases, unfortunately, damage the community. So we have a number of popular attractions across the world. The Great Barrier Reef, which is to your right in Australia. We have Harrison's Cave, Barbados, Kaitour Falls in Jamaica, the Grand Canyon. Oh, I have canyon spelled wrong, sorry. And Crater Lake. Anyone want to tell me or share some other popular attractions that come to mind? Popular natural attractions? Yes, Nicholas.
Oh, you see it, Veronica. I was going to say, the students here are very professional. They raise their hands before they speak. So go ahead.
I don't mind raising my hand either. I could just speak straight away. Is Mount Everest?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Definitely. Yes, Shanice.
The Yellowstone National Park.
Yes, that's a great example, and that's a huge park. So national parks make up a significant portion of natural attractions across the world. And it also ties into something I'll touch on later. The concept of creating national parks is actually a global and UN required type conservation effort to establish national parks throughout the world in order to protect natural attractions and natural environments. So that's a perfect example of that. So let's get into the meat of it, cave attractions. And I love caves. It may sound like an odd thing to say, but prior to going to Harrison's Cave, I had some knowledge, but limited knowledge about caves. I can now say that caves are exciting, and every place that I travel to, I try to visit a cave attraction there. So I'm going to use some terms in this from this point on. I'm going to use terms like show caves, cave attractions, and a couple of abbreviations. So as I get to them, I'll just explain them once, and then we can follow along after. So some of the attractions, some of the most visited attractions, caves are some of the most visited attractions worldwide. So in the world, you have thousands and millions of cave networks, and only a very tiny percentage of caves are actually show caves. So it's estimated that, for instance, in one area alone in Missouri, where they have huge cave networks, they have in that area alone over 1,800 cave systems, and only 1 to 2% of those are actually traversable, and even a smaller subset of those are open to the public. So it's a unique and diverse ecosystem, and they're broken down into multiple categories. So we have living caves, and then we have mature caves. I don't want to use the word dead, but they're not living. They're not active, let's say. Then we have sea and underwater caves, and we have land-based caves. So there's a plethora of diversity within cave ecosystems. Some of them are just water caves where water passes through, much like Cole's Cave. Others of them have unique large habitats. So you might see, as in the case of Harrison's Cave, crayfish and other life living in the cave, and bats, different species of bats. They're the home to millions and millions of bats. And certainly in Barbados, we have huge bat colonies that inhabit our cave networks and our gully networks specifically. So if you're ever outside at dusk and you start to see droves of bats, a lot of those come out of our gully and cave networks, many of which are still undiscovered in Barbados. There are over 1,200 show caves that are visited worldwide annually, and 70 million visitors approximately visit those caves per annum. It represents a whopping $856 million in entry sales. And certainly in Barbados, it is our top attraction in terms of entry sales and so on. For many, many years, we were able to attract hundreds of thousands of visitors. Now we've diversified and have some stronger visitor management. Those numbers have changed and fluctuated post redevelopment, but that's for good reason, and I'll touch on that later on. And then all these entry sales globally account for over $2 billion in tourism revenue. And much of that can be transformative. A lot of the large cave systems exist in the US. A lot of the more developed show cave networks are in the US, just because the developing world doesn't always have the expertise and the speleological expertise to navigate them. Certainly in Barbados, where you might have a lot of people knowing who live in an area. So for instance, if you live in St. Thomas or you live in St. Andrew, you might know of Cole's Cave. You might even have traversed it spelunking. This time with all this rain would be a really bad time to go exploring Coles Cave. It's not fully mapped. There are people who offer guided tours, but it's a really dangerous cave network to go in if you're unfamiliar. And I'm sure many of you would have seen when that football got lost in, I think, Indonesia, it may have been. And just globally, caves are not to be played with. They're to be respected, they're to be sustained, and they're to be awed for their beauty, but they're very, very, in some cases, fragile networks. And we're really blessed to be able to view live a living cave network in Harrison's Cave. And of course, what we see goes far beyond, the cave network goes far beyond what we see, and it actually goes all the way down, some experts suggest, as far as Spring Garden near Mount Gay Distillery. So that cave network is really expansive. When the redevelopment, the initial excavation was done, they only opened about a mile of cave network to the public, because beyond that point, the network got very much like the top photo that you see here on screen. And I had the privilege and pleasure to be able to go through all those natural passages. And though it was an amazing experience, it was a very harrowing experience, because that terrain is not for the faint of heart. And your range of sight and motion is very, very narrow. There's some areas you can't even turn your head left or right. You're just crawling and hoping that you get out on the other side. So Harrison's Cave, one of my favorite places on earth. So Harrison's Cave, as you can see here on the slide, is a land-based visitor attraction. It's made up of limestone formations called stalactites and stalagmites. It has tons of subterranean passages. It goes on for miles and miles, and it has lakes, streams, waterfalls, and even a substrate that is likened to quicksand. So there's some areas in Harrison's Cave you actually cannot go into because you will sink, and it's dead mud and silt, and it's beautiful. It's in one of the most beautiful areas of the cave called Mirror Lake. And so it looks like it's really shallow and like you can just step in there. You cannot step in there, you will start to disappear. So a bit about the history, and I'm going to spend a bit of time here. About 100 years ago, children of the area of St. Thomas in the center of the island, known as the Alley and Wetchman Hall, played in a flourishing basin garden oasis. It was a whimsical and enchanted gully, housing trees and botanicals, many of which were indigenous to Barbados and subsequently exported after being created here, like grapefruits and shaddocks, which was actually created here. And there are a ton of botanicals within and around Harrison's Cave that are only found in this part of the world. These children played cricket, they played rounders, and they did all of this in and around, and in many cases lived on top of what we now know as Harrison's Cave. At that time, people were born there, literally born there, and lived there in for generations. And many of them still inhabit the place. So when I give you that kind of overview, I don't know if any of you actually live in that area or live in more country or rural areas. That kind of history is really important and central to community incorporation within development of tourism attractions. And can anyone imagine knowing that background and knowing that this beautiful marvel existed and people just existed in harmony with it? In some cases, people really didn't go too deeply into it, but they respected it and they played around and they still lived with it. Later, we'll talk about some of the impacts, negative and positive of that, but would anyone like to share what that would mean to you if you grew up in an area like that? What then would Harrison's Cave mean to you? And the kind of sense of ownership that you may have over an area like that. No one? Well, I'll tell you what it means to me, because after being hired to work there in 2009, I discovered a lot about my personal ancestry. And I discovered that my ancestors were born on a plantation not too far from Harrison's Cave, from one of the last free slaves that existed on that plantation, and didn't go too far away. They went maybe 2 miles away to the area called Allen View. And I actually have relatives, or had, because some of them have passed away, that literally live in one street over from Harrison's Cave. And in doing my mapping, my genealogy, I realized that my grandfather is pictured as one of those kids in the early days playing in what we now know as Harrison's Cave. And like I said, there are a lot of residents who still live there. It's a very generational community. So you will find a lot of people that were born there just stay there. A lot of people don't migrate out of the area. And so there's a huge sense of ownership and pride associated with that area of Allen View, the alley. My mother, I discovered, was actually born there. And so it's very near and dear to my heart now that I have some of that information. And now I understand when things were handled not in the greatest way and we had some blowback or antagonism, why we got that from residents and community members, because those people feel moved and intrinsically linked with that attraction. To them, it's not an attraction. To them, it is home. So in 1974, a Danish speleologist called Ole Sorensen and a Barbadian called Tony Mason embarked on the journey of their lifetimes. And so Ole came to Barbados, like many people at that time, and he was exploring and looking. And because he was into speleology, and speleology, before I go any further, is the study of caves and geological networks associated with caves. And you can imagine, 1974 or in the early to mid 1900s, we didn't have any speleologists in Barbados because we didn't even think we had caves. And so in 1974, when Ole was here, he had been on a number of trips. And in the last one prior to this, he discovered the initial area that is one of the first passages, natural passages of Harrison's Cave. And he decided he wanted to explore it and he really wanted to map it. At that time, we did not know what it would become. He invited a Barbadian, Tony, from the area to come with him and enter this cave and map it as they explored it. The cave at that point had been an established cave system for hundreds of years. And as they got deeper and deeper into the network and found areas like the Great Hall, which has expansive ceilings, they would have realized that this network was a living, breathing cave, still alive and growing. And so there's some areas in the cave that you're going to see, instead of stalactites and stalagmites, you're going to see rich, creamy, almost like milk dripping down the walls. That is a sign of a living, active and breathing, active cave. And when they saw this, they marveled. And so they continued to go. And when they came out, they were the siren song for, oh my goodness, everyone needs to see this attraction. After that, the government embarked on what would then be a 30+ year journey of initial development and opening, and then subsequently redevelopment in the late 90s to early 2000s that was completed by 2010. Harrison's Cave is one of the only drive-in cave experiences in the world. So we have a very rare gem here. There's only one drive-in cave tour experience or show cave in North America, one single, and that's Fantastic Caverns in Missouri. And outside of that, we were one of the last surviving caves that was able to do a drive-in cave experience. The jury is out if driving in is the best way to view a cave network or not. By the end of this lecture, you guys can tell me what your thoughts are. Most caves are not guided tours, whereas our cave does offer a guided tour experience for all its tour suite. And across the world, many caves are just walking tours. And a lot of them, I would say the vast majority of them are self-guided tours, where you go to the entrance, you pay your money and you explore. And whenever you come back, you come back. The drawback of that is that we can't control humans. And imagine letting unaccompanied humans into a delicate ecosystem on a daily basis without visitor management, volume management, CO2 management, and everything that goes alongside of it. So in and of itself, having guided tours is a protection mechanism for a natural attraction like a cave. Harrison Cave boasts in its heyday almost 200,000 visitors per year. At this point, or at the point when I left a couple years ago, we were seeing on average between 100 and 200,000 per year. And that would have fluctuated such a large range because, of course, when we reopened in 2010, we had to ramp back up to our original time. Hi, Rakala. Sorry if I said your name.
No, that's fine. You called it correctly the first time, but I wanted just to agree on the point where you said that it's a privilege to have a drive-in cave. Because when I visited Mexico in July, we had a tour of a cenote, and the only way that we could explore it was through swimming. And the cave was between 5 feet and 25 feet deep. And I mean, it was truly scary at first. And like the water was really, 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 really cold, but it was still very refreshing. So I mean, to even be able to explore that cave, you must be able to swim at least, or keep yourself afloat. So
well,
I can.
Were you in Cancun or Cozumel?
Cancun.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the tour also was a guided tour.
Yeah. Yeah, they have amazing cave networks in Mexico. And a lot of them are either spelunking or diving. I think they may have one or two rappel options, but there's a diversity in how you actually enter a cave. A lot of the caves in North America, you actually have to hike and then rappel into the cave. So you literally have to carry rock climbing gear, and then you're anchored off at the top of a rock face. And then you literally throw yourself off of the rock to descend into the mouth of the cave. And then you go exploring from there. And then, of course, you have to climb back out. So we're really, really privileged to have the ability to do now both a drive-in and spelunking or walking type tour at Harrison's Cave. It's a direct contributor to our GDP. So as a direct tourism contributor, we earn millions and have over the last 40 years earned millions and millions of dollars in direct tourism revenue. And you're able now to descend about a mile into the cave. But like I said before, that cave network is very expansive. If anybody knows the area, the cave network far extends past Holy Innocents Church, which is just shy of a mile away on the surface. And then it extends in the other direction several miles. There's a natural entrance and passage in a gully nearby where most of the bats that Harrison's Cave is home to live. And bats are incredibly important for global ecosystems and for food security. So the protection of this visitor attraction goes far beyond just making tourism dollars, right? So that's why the need for sustainability should also go beyond a focus of tourism dollars. So the goals of sustainable development, certainly in the case of Harrison's Cave, the overarching goal was environmental management and protection of the natural environment of Harrison's Cave. Like I said, it's a diverse, living, breathing cave. And the aim was to protect as much of that. Of course, there was damage. Of course, there were missteps in the early days. Like I said, we didn't have the same expertise that we have now and the same knowledge. But efforts were made certainly in the planning stage of the redevelopment project to mitigate and learn from the early days of what was done wrong or what we now know as better practice. One of the main hallmarks was also supporting local communities. And that was an opportunity, that was to mainly create opportunities for people in the area, and that's revenue earning opportunities. So whether that was a canteen or a rum shop in the area, they would benefit from the tourism because visitors had to walk into the attraction. Protection of those communities and helping them, cultural preservation and access. And I want you to remember these ones as we get into the development, because at the end, I'm going to ask you, like, what are your suggestions on what could have been done better or what can still be done better? Enhancing the visitor experience. So this was a major one. At the time that the redevelopment was planned or was conceptualized in the 90s, Harrison's Cave had one product. So since 1981, there was just one product. Harrison's Cave existed under what we now know as the National Conservation Commission, which is also a really important point to remember later on. And so being able to protect it and so on was of paramount importance. However, it was very rustic. In the old days, it was very, 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 very rustic. So the plan was to enhance it in that way so that it would be a lot better, a lot nicer visitor experience, a lot easier to traverse and offer a diversity of experiences, as well as the importance of education and product delivery. So that was why the visitor center was created, and that's why the new gift shop area was created and other areas for delivery of the product. So an enhanced entrance area to the cave, an enhanced tram keeping area, all of that was to enhance the visitor experience. And like I said, Harrison's Cave is rare in that it is a drive-in cave. And so there's a lot that went into the development of the vehicles that traverse Harrison's Cave. So Harrison's Cave had electric vehicles for the longest time, way prior to most Bajans driving electric vehicles. And that's because you cannot have high levels of CO2 and emissions within the cave network. It's detrimental to the actual cave features. Expert consultancy, so they had to hire a ton of people. So like I said, there are a lot of geologists on the island now, but at that time in the 90s, they hired a lot of speleological consultants out of the show cave associations of the US and other parts of the world, Europe, Denmark, just to make sure that they had the best of the best on the team to advise them on what would be the best, most sustainable way to develop the cave. There were a lot of linkages formed. Part of that was because of the Caves Act implementation, such as linkages with the EPD, which is the Environmental Protection Department. And that department actually was responsible for testing the cave and helping with monitoring of the cave. So they test the water for us, because keeping the cave in balance is very, very important and actually really incredibly expensive. So daily, the cave maintenance staff do actual water testing in different pools within the cave to make sure that the pH is not off. Because if the pH is off, so if we have a downpour of rain, you're going to walk through the cave and realize a lot of the features look brown and kind of murky. And if you don't kind of clean them off and let fresh water run over them, it could actually stop their growth altogether. So there was a lot of emphasis put on the environmental management that would take place or have to take place during the development of Harrison's Cave. And that was from a local and international perspective. And you should be happy to know that now, or at that time, all of the cave monitors and maintenance persons were Barbadian by that time. So on-site teams, like I said, focused on sustainability at the very senior level. So as part of the management team I was a part of, as well as involved in the early development plans for the actual project. And something I also wanted to mention here, it's really important to note that Harrison's Cave falls under the Ministry of the Environment, or fell under the Ministry of Environment during that period. And I'll touch on why that is super important in a little bit. So Harrison's Cave and the community. So we have historical and cultural importance. So there are a ton of family ties that people have with Harrison's Cave. Like I mentioned before, there's a sense of ownership in the area because of how the attraction existed prior to development. Then we have stuff like community outreach activities and collaboration. So even prior to the redevelopment, there was a strong emphasis on making sure that the host community was engaged at every level, and that we were able to collaborate with them wherever possible. So in some cases that was artwork. In other cases that was actually hiring. There was a vast majority of staff before Harrison's Cave entered into this current lease agreement that it's in now with Chukka, when it was run by Caves of Barbados Limited, where I would say at the time, maybe 30% of the staff was from the area, and another 30% was from, maybe if you spanned out another 5 miles. And so you had a lot of people from the area that were able to benefit. Actually, one of the early excavators who actually dug the first portion of the cave with a bobcat, he is still alive, and he was actually from the area. I believe he's moved out of the area now. And others who were a part of that are actually went on to work in the cave, went on to be some of the first drivers, and was there still by the time I joined the team in 2010, ended up being one of our longest standing workers. So managing the community was also a major part, because the community was so entrenched, both from a physical, cultural, and socioeconomic perspective. To speak to the socioeconomic perspective, you had community shop space that was built into that plan, where instead of persons just happenstancing into areas of commerce leading into the cave, there was a deliberate measure to help residents get their businesses together at a level that would be befitting of, or what people consider befitting of, tourists. But there were also shops created and designated for community members to ply their trades, sell their crafts, and offer services on the valley floor. There were a number of initiatives. One was called the Heart of Barbados, which allowed locals in the area to get free passes for Harrison's Cave, and a passport of other attractions in the area as well that we used to work with. In addition to that, there was no event, nothing, including the launch, that did not include community members. So we had a soft launch just for the community. So some of the elderly persons in the community who would have been around, like my grandfather at the time prior to its discovery, they were invited first for free to tour the cave, to see the cave. And at that time, I don't know if they still have it now, but we had footage of someone who subsequently became 100 years old, crying and weeping on the valley floor because she was so moved at what was done. She couldn't, although she literally lived less than a minute away, she didn't realize all of this was happening, and she was so proud and happy to be invited and just be a part of this major development. And that went on for many years. We never stopped outreaching to the community. We would visit. I had the privilege of visiting 2 centenarians twice, one of them 3 times. So to meet somebody that's 100 years old is rare. To meet 2 people that turn 100 and then 101 and then 102 who are best friends, who live next door and are a gap away from your workplace, is pretty cool. And all this to say, Harrison's Cave and the community are intrinsically linked. Because of that intrinsic link, relationship challenges occurred. And this is one of the downfalls or the kind of con side of tourism and tourism development. You're always going to have, you can't please everyone. And all of it is not just people being frustrated for frustrated sake. Sometimes in the planning process and in the execution process, missteps happen and missteps are made. And so some of those missteps resulted in antagonism, resentment, in some cases, anger, and having to diffuse situations, especially close to when we reopened. Because like I said, there's a land legacy in that area. And during the redevelopment, the government had to compulsory acquire a lot of land. And some of these persons thought that, or believe, and they rightfully so, that the land was their birthright. And to travel or be living overseas and then come home and you don't have your land anymore because it's now the visitor center. Yeah, the visitor center is good for Barbados, but it's not good if that's the only land you had to pass down to your children or your grandchildren. And so unfortunately, in the early days of opening, we had to handle that. I think it was a very good character building experience, and it was a good tourism lesson for me to learn at a very young age, because you were seeing the positives and negatives of tourism development right before your eyes. And I was able, thankfully, to empathize with those people, partly because I was not the one who did that to them. But unfortunately, though I was not the one to do that to them, I was the face of the cave at the time. So I had no choice but to hear them. I spent countless hours myself and the CEO at the time inviting people to come into our office. There was a period around reopening where we just had to have open office days so that persons in the community could come and air their grievances. And we just had to listen. So the Harrison's Cave development. So the initial discovery by Ole and Tony was in 1974. And then we had the redevelopment that started with the establishment of Caves of Barbados Limited and the Caves Act. So development at that time was around excavation and construction. So Barbados wanted to have this beautiful marvel become an attraction. So the aim was, how do we get in here? How do we open it up so it's wide enough for a vehicle to drive through? And then how do we get people to see it? That was the primary focus. At that time, no one had the knowledge or the expertise to know exactly how to do that. And so what did they do? They did the best practice in the rest of the world. And that was giant bobcats and big hill tees literally bulldozing through the cave. And you can imagine what happens when you have that giant machinery and you're going feet in front of you and nothing is there. So you don't know if you're going to open out into a really wide space or a narrow space. And because of that, you also don't know if you're going to drop down. So there was a bit of fear associated with that. And they used, like I said, bobcats, a lot of excavation equipment, dynamite in some areas. And just imagine you are a resident in the area cooking your lunch and you're feeling the earth beneath you shake because they're doing these scheduled explosions underneath your home, you know? Now in 2023, we'll be flabbergasted like, oh my God, you dropped down. But at that time, there was no other way they thought that they could do it. And we certainly didn't have the machinery we have now on island. So a lot of the excavation staff actually ended up being Barbadians and people from the area. So some of those early guys, when I spoke to them, said even very young kids would come home from school, they would head down to the cave and somebody would put them to work, get a shovel, get a pick, and they would just go and do it. And they were not doing it at that time for money because hell, there was no money. It was, I'm going to be a part of this thing. Of course, there was a lot of danger in that. Like I said, there's some areas in the cave where an inch to the right or the left means that you could drop 100 feet. And so the concept of these young Barbadians just blindly being like, yeah, I'm going to drive this giant bobcat in here. And the fire service probably only has ropes because it's 1974 and there's no way for them to save me or help me. When we think about it today, it sounds crazy and ridiculous that they did that, but that is what our foreparents did to get us what we have. So in 1981, we opened Harrison's Cave with just one product, which was the tram tour. At that time, the attraction fell under the auspices of what was the Parks and Beaches Ministry Division. That subsequently became the National Conservation Commission, which we know right now is responsible for cleaning roads, green spaces, parks, and recreational areas across the country, and of course, our beaches. So what does that mean? That means that the people actually managing and monitoring Harrison's Cave were rangers. We're just regular men and women who used to work on the beach and were pulled, oh, go to Harrison's Cave and just make sure nobody touches anything. So they had very basic training, but like I said, it's very important that it fell under the Ministry of the Ministry of Environment and not tourism. And this is important, and you guys can tell me what you think about this. Before I entered working at the cave, I always wondered why Harrison's Cave was not managed by tourism. It's a tourist attraction after all, right? So why wouldn't it be managed by the entity that manages tourism in Barbados? How are you going to get anything done? How is it going to be efficient? It can't be effective under anything other than tourism. As I entered and was able to look at all the development documents and the plans and work closely with the project coordinator, who is an environmental management specialist, it became clear that there's no other place that Harrison's Cave should fall into. Yes, it's a visitor attraction, but it is an environmental marvel first. And if we do not protect it, if it's not sustainably developed, we will just lose it. And like I said, it's too central to so much of what we have in Barbados. So our water table, Harrison's Cave is essential to our water table. Our bat life, and therefore our agriculture sector, it is intrinsically linked. So it makes sense that it is linked to the Ministry of Tourism and that it fell under that auspices for many, many, many years, for several decades, and certainly even coming out of the redevelopment. Technically, I was kind of a subcontractor of the Ministry of Environment, and that was paramount. Can anyone give me any suggestions or have any comments about a natural attraction being managed by the Ministry of Environment versus the Ministry of Tourism, and what it could look like if it was managed by either?
While we wait for somebody to raise their hand, Veronica, I'm just letting you know that some of the students are having a poor Wi-Fi connection, and therefore they cannot participate as they normally do. They did, but I see Nicholas is raising his hand there, so I'm going to hand back over to you.
Okay, come on, Nick, let's hear it.
Yeah, so seeing an attraction being managed by the Ministry of Environment, their focus is sustaining and making sure that it lives on and is healthy. Even though the Ministry of Tourism may want to see that happen, they do focus on the numbers, how many people they could get to attraction, how much money they can make. And the environment does fall on the back end, even though everyone does say, like, yes, this is a focus because it is important for the future. Their main focus is getting people to the attraction and keeping it active. But the Ministry of Environment, their primary focus is making sure that it lives on. So that's how I see it.
Yeah, that's perfect. And that's absolutely 1,000% right. I remember having discussions early when we were planning our opening and we invited tour companies, tour operators, Foster & Nitz, Goddard's at the time, and other smaller operators to come to our soft opening, come see the attraction. And one of the main pieces of scrutiny was the fact that we were adamant about maintaining volume, visitor control, and management. And so the tram tour can only has a capacity of 32 persons on the tram. In addition to that, you're only allowed to do a certain number of trips per hour per day. Yes, Nick.
Yeah, I agree with the capacity control. I think that's one of the major issues on the island right now, because I work currently for Fossanet and I've worked for St. James Travel and Tours, and I operate mostly within the tours section and transport. And seeing the amount of ships that come to the island and the times they come and the amount of tours we send to places, the one thing that's always on my mind is, can all these people go to this one attraction and not affect it or not have any sort of negative impact on it? And then not even focusing on these ships, the amount of airplanes that come in and the amount of stay over passengers we have. Like, the island can't handle it from my viewpoint. Like, Harrison's Cave, they could only have so many tours on a day. They could only have so many people going in at one time. So where does the balance lie with having all these ships, having all these planes come in, and our natural attractions? Because most of our majority of our attractions are natural, and they will be impacted negatively with the amount of people we have coming into the island.
Yeah, it's 100%. You're 100% correct. And there were times that I was in the lobby and saw 10 tour buses with 30 odd persons each descend on the attraction. And so inadequate visitor management is always going to be a challenge, right? So you have sales team trying to manage visitor expectations at the top, and you have the tours team who, again, they're in there every single day. They have a real sense of ownership about it, and they're the ones that can tell this stalactite looks different today from yesterday, or last week from last year. So even when we always had this kind of tug of war, there were times when sales team up top is like, okay, we got 300 people up here, let's have a strategy to get them in. And tours team would drag their feet. And as a manager, it used to be frustrating, but you have to understand people, and you have to understand what people are doing and what roles people adopt. And although they were not cave monitors, they adopted the role of cave protectors. And they were the ones like, we could send tours down, and the tours are going to go in very differently to however I sent them down. And so I had to, once I learned and understood their reasoning and their rationale for doing what they did and doing it how they did it, I just took hands off in some cases and let them do their job, knowing and trusting that they were acting in the best interest of the country, the attraction, and getting visitors the experience that they wanted. And sometimes that meant that tour guides were walking the valley floor showing people plants, right? Because no more tourists could get into the cave. So yes, that was a very huge thing to manage. And I think the blessing at that time was that it was under the Ministry of Environment, because then it allowed us to be able to leverage agencies like the Environmental Protection Department, like the labs and all these things, to be able to support our environmental team and cave monitors. So we had an environmental officer whose sole job, full-time, all day, was to manage and monitor the cave environment. And then she had staff who worked from 6, I think, or 7 a.m. till 5 p.m., who their job was to come in every morning before everyone else, walk the cave in silence with just a flashlight, and check and monitor the cave. Because even something as simple as light, people overlook that. Not only do you have to worry about CO2 emissions, you have to worry about light. Cave networks exist in total darkness. They are the darkest place on Earth. There's no place else darker than the inside of a cave, because when you get into the belly of the Earth, no light can get there, right? So if you were to go into Harrison's Cave and they turned off the lights when you're in the bottom of the cave, you cannot see your hand, you're nothing in front of you. I don't care if you're wearing all white, you can see absolutely nothing. Initially, it was a little scary, but I got to the point where I was able to walk through the cave by myself in the darkness and feel comfortable. But those persons are there to monitor. So they monitor water levels, water quality, pH, life in the cave. So they monitor crayfish and other organism development. There were some little creatures that were kind of akin to an anemone. They manage rock falls because periodically there were rock falls coming from different portions of the cave. So if there was a rock fall, by the time we got in as a management team at 8 o'clock, they were able to say, okay, so I found X here and Y. We would do an assessment if it merited an assessment, and then determine if we do caves. And again, that's where sustainable tourism and tourists and the tourism agency can have friction, because there were a number of times where we had to make the decision to shut down the cave for both visitor safety and cave protection. And it was met with extreme blowback. I can't tell you how many times we were in the paper for doing what we knew was best, you know? And it's hard to be blasted in cabinet. My name got blasted for doing things, and to be blasted in the public because people assume that you're just not doing your job, but oftentimes it was imperative to shut it down. We had weather systems pass, and when I got into work that morning, the cave maintenance team was distraught because when they did their check, the road no longer existed. And they knew all the work that needed to be done to get all that soot and rock that wasn't supposed to be where it is now back where it's supposed to be, and just completely do that. And unfortunately, even in the short time I was there, we had to do that multiple times. And I had to get a wheelbarrow and get a shovel and help everybody because it was all hands on deck to protect it. Yes, Nick.
Hang on, Veronica, before Nicholas, there is a comment in the chat from earlier. Perhaps you want to, I don't know if the person, Raquel, if you want to elaborate, or Veronica, could you have a look at it?
Let me see.
Sorry, Nicholas, you're next.
That's no problem.
Yes.
The comment was based on when she asked about the tourism ministry managing as opposed the environmental ministry managing as opposed to tourism ministry. So that's where the comment stems from.
Yeah, for sure. That's absolutely correct. Yeah, that was the concept that they devised. The Cave Act was enacted in the year 2000. And that was a couple months after, just over a year after the Caves of Barbados Limited. So the abbreviation here I have is CBL. That stands for Caves of Barbados Limited. Caves of Barbados Limited was a private company that was established by government in March of 1999. And its mandate was to manage the operations of Harrison's Cave and manage the redevelopment project for Harrison's Cave over the next decade. The Caves Act was subsequently enacted in the year 2000. Prior to that, though there was a general sense of importance and significance, the government thought that they needed to ratify the level and depth of that importance. And so if anyone is interested, I have the Caves Act as a resource, and so I can share that with you. You could also Google both the incorporation of Caves of Barbados Limited and why, and the Caves Act of Barbados is called, and it's available for viewing, but I could also share the link so that you can grab the articles. Yes, Nick.
Yeah, I wanted to answer a question and also add a comment. My question is in regards to how you handled some of this backlash when you would have had to close the cave because of any damages or natural occurrences. Because it's interesting that you mentioned these things, because I would have been one of the persons on the other end where I have a tour coming to Harrison's Cave and we get a message like 10 minutes or half an hour before the tour saying, yeah, we're not able to go to Harrison's Cave today. We got to find an alternative. And then also being at the cave where there are a lot of people at one time, and I'm being told, okay, your tour is going to be delayed. You have to do something else, walk through the garden, walk through the gully or something, then come back at a certain time. So how how did you handle some of these situations?
A lot of time with a smile and some patience, because as you know, as a ground handler, y'all are not always the nicest. And so
Apologies. I apologize for the community.
And so it was a delicate balance. I had very good relationships with a lot of the tour operators and the ground handlers, but that didn't exempt me from getting cussed, to be honest. And some days we would just take it. Some days we would try to explain why. But oftentimes the explanation didn't matter, right? Because you already, like you said, you got a whole 2 tour buses coming up Allen View, and where you're supposed to take these persons. So it's a really delicate balance, right? There were times where we tried to figure out, okay, can we actually move these people through the cave? And we had a very collaborative approach to the organization. So it would not be me as marketing making that decision, right? It would be me speaking to sales, speaking to tours, speaking to the environmental coordinator, trying to ascertain what can we do and what's the max we can do that's safe and what's the minimum that we can do. And that is how we just had to make those decisions. And I trusted my team. And so it was not a ton of me pushing back. If I could squeeze a few more people, I would try, but oftentimes we understood what the reason is. And sometimes it was beyond just trying to manage numbers. Sometimes like I said, it was natural disasters. So we had a ton of hurricanes or weather systems that would have passed. And like I said, that water, if we look at the flooding that happens above the ground, right? We had a freak storm the other day, the rain falls for 20 minutes, the place is flooded. Imagine what happens underground, right? Imagine the force at which water travels underground. It is such force that it can lift gravel and move an entire roadway. It's that forceful. There were times after bad storms that I would walk into the cave and be like, I don't even, like, where was this thing? Entire wires and conduits and everything that was associated with lights was just lifted out. And so there were times we had to say that to ground handlers, and they were like, so you can't just fix it back and let's get in. Not realizing why. But I mean, we also got that on a daily basis, you know, visitors sitting on the trams and reaching out and trying to touch the walls, even though they're told you can't do that. So we went the route of trying to educate. And when that failed, just accepting the licks. There was nothing else that we could do, but we knew our mandate.
It kind of shows how the stakeholders don't see what happens in the back end, like government and the tour operators, that there are other things that affect your operation, which unfortunately affect your own operation itself. So yeah.
Correct. And to be honest, like I said, I'm grateful that we weren't managed by tourism, because I think our mandate would have been different at the time. And so sometimes I may have had to not listen to the other members of the team if I was getting a call from a screaming minister of tourism saying, get them in, you know what I mean? Not that actually happened, but if it was under tourism, you can see the pressures.
But it could happen.
It definitely could. But this is being recorded. But it can be difficult. But of course, the road and infrastructure development extended beyond the internal cave system. And actually during the redevelopment, it didn't include the internal cave at all, except for changing out of lighting. A lot of the road and infrastructure development happened outside of the cave in the immediate vicinity. Like I said, we had electric vehicles, and those are actually patented proprietary trams. So that's a little known fact that Bajans kind of, I guess, take for granted. There's nowhere else in the world that has that Harrison's Cave tram. For many years, we had a part of the fiberglass mold that built those trams on a property that we worked with nearby. And so they couldn't even be replicated if you wanted to, you know, it was purpose built just for us, just for that width to be able to get through that natural passage. And as you would know, there are no two roads. There's one way in, one way out, and it's designed deliberately in that way to have the minimal impact. Can you imagine if you had a roadway sized road inside Harrison's Cave, how much devastation you would have had to cause to allow for that? Would it have made for more efficient tours and more people? 100%. Would it have been better for the attraction? Definitely not. So in 2010, we relaunched the tourism product, and Caves of Barbados Limited hired a ton of people. So they hired a management team, including myself, and we embarked on that last mile of closing off of the redevelopment project, implementing some of the road infrastructure plans that would happen after the main cave development was done. And of course, relaunching the product to the market and to the tour operators and ground handlers like Nick, and reintroducing it to the cruise market via the Florida Caribbean Cruise Association based in Miami, and even the Ministry of Tourism. We also had a big emphasis on expanding the product suite, because the number of tram tours you can do is a finite amount, right? However, by diversifying the product suite, there were other areas for revenue generation and for tour revenue generation that could have been derived without having such a great impact. So for instance, we added the BAT program, which was a fully above ground program that used our visitor center. It was open to primary school age students between the ages of 3 and 12, I think we did, from nursery to primary. We had the Eco Adventure Tour, which was a spelunking tour, which just means you're crawling through the natural passages of the cave and you're walking through the cave. So there's no vehicle. You don't need to have a ton of gear and stuff like that. You just need to wear some old clothes you don't mind getting dirty, some shoes that you're not wedded to, and you're taken on a walking guided tour, hike through the cave. We had gully tours that we implemented, kids educational programs. We started to offer special events and parties, which were on the valley floor, so they didn't impact the cave. But now you can see how the redevelopment was expanding the reach of what was possible at the attraction at that time. We had a restaurant and an enhanced souvenir shop. So we were able to do puppet shows and prop over events and all this fun stuff without even touching the actual interior of the cave. And still obviously earning revenue as part of that. So we touched on this quite a bit by this point, the importance of government and policy. And one is to protect the impact on the lives of the host population. And we had a number of examples of both positive and negative. So one of the positive ones was opportunities for work. So we had a lot of residents, like I said, working there, and then infrastructure improvement. As part of the redevelopment project, a lot of people couldn't understand why there was a road infrastructure project that followed. It was because the community is important to the government. And so you can't just make the attraction cute for tourists. You also need to make the road to get there good for residents and the said same tour buses that are going to be coming. I don't know if anyone remembers, or even if you drive through St. Joseph today, there's road in the potholes. There are no potholes in the road. That's how bad the roads used to be. And so there was a major emphasis done on improving the roads, adding sidewalks. And those sidewalks are going to benefit residents a lot more than they're going to benefit tourists, right? And they did that about, I'm going to say, was it a mile or two away from the cave as well, so that it benefited the neighboring communities. One of the cons, unfortunately, was issues like the acquisition of generational land and the fallback from that. Sometimes it was poor communication. So maybe something had to be extended, or there had to be a road closure and there was not adequate notification. So then it disenfranchised the local community for one reason or the other. There was the importance of protection legislation. So the Caves Act is a very powerful piece of legislation that has a lot of mandates and considerations within it, which was paramount. Policies and regulations associated with future development. So the redevelopment plan, as we saw and implemented and launched the reopening of the cave in 2010, didn't exhaust the gamut of future tourism attractions development that was in train. So the document held stuff much like what we see today with Chaka, zip line capability, and a ton of other things we wanted to build in. Some of them were not possible at the time. Others were stopped for one reason or the other. And now, of course, the attraction is in the hands of a third party. And so the involvement there is going to be very different. So what happens if the goals, the sustainable goals we talked about earlier, are not met? So we have a number of examples here, and I'm going to ask you, I'm going to kind of stop halfway and ask you for some insights that you might have on this, and you can take some time while I go through the first three to think about, what are examples like that I could see either internationally, regionally, or locally, or even in anything that I've said so far about the Harrison's Cave redevelopment. So we have Mount Everest. If anybody has followed the news in the last couple of years, the people that actually live here are so sick and tired of us trying to hike this mountain. The amount of trash, garbage, and challenges and resources that it takes at base camp is devastating to that area. And it has it is so bad at this point that I will never visit Mount Everest, and I would probably try to deter people from going because the relative impact on the host population is ridiculous. We have the tree of Tenere in the Sahara. This is completely destroyed. This no longer exists. I'm trying to remember if this is an actual image or an AI generated image of what it would have looked like. I'm trying to remember, but either way, AI is all we have now because that tree is gone. Many years ago, a tourist, again, drunk, doing the most, was driving a Jeep and literally ran it over. The tree of Tenere was a landmark and an icon in the Sahara for millennia. I mean, it's been there forever. It allowed explorers to be able to figure out where they were because it was literally a tree standing alone in an open desert. It was known as the tree that stands alone. So it was, from a directional perspective, it was helpful. So if you got lost, you could find your way because you would then know which way is north, south, east, or west and whatnot. But here is an example of how tourism can really mess things up, right? Or allowing people in space unregulated can affect them. And then we have Pont des Arts Bridge, which is also known as Le Bloc Bridge in Paris. And it's so amazing. This is known as Le Bloc Bridge, and that's now like the attraction. But the attraction was that there was a bridge that allowed you to look at a beautiful body of water. And then some bright tourist decided, I love you, and I'm going to put this on here to commemorate it. And then everybody else did. And so now when you stand back from the bridge, you can't even see or get close to what you were going there to look at, you know? And so I'll pause here before I go into the example of the underwater Amazon to see if anyone has any comments or sentiments that they want to share around what can happen when these sustainable development goals aren't met. Anyone will all rush to answer. Okay, I'll go into the underwater. Oh, yes, Nick.
I think it goes back again to the conversation about who is managing what. And like, again, if tourism is managing it, we have mostly the outlook as to getting people there. And even though the conversation is still very big on the sustainable development goals and everyone is saying, yes, we're trying to meet these goals, we're trying to do everything that is virtually and physically possible to be sustainable and take the environment into consideration, even people, it will still lead to looking at the numbers, looking at how much money, looking at how many people, looking at what we can do to get more people. But if the environment, if the Ministry of the Environment is really managing some of these attractions and not giving tourism the control over who is able to go and when they're able to go and how many, they might survive. Like
Yeah.
you have the Amazon, so if we look at the actual Amazon, look at how much of it is disappearing because of our impact of visiting and then even cutting down the trees, even though that's not tourism, but tourism does have an impact and an influence into these sort of things. So again, I think it's looking at who is controlling what.
Yeah, 100%. And then even with your example of the Amazon, like we need to remember that we have a responsibility to ourselves and future generations, right? I think it's fair to say we all breathe oxygen. And so the Amazon is literally the Earth's purifier. And for us in this hemisphere, it is definitely our purifier. So when you see the degradation of these environments, it affects our air quality. In the case of like the underwater Amazon, it affects our ocean and fisheries. It affects the balance of our ecosystems that could result in overgrowth of other things. Like it's so critical. Natural attractions, because they're just that natural, often have, I don't even know of one that doesn't have a link or an impact or is not impacted by the environment that it's in and a long-term effect on all of us as a globe, you know? So what the underwater Amazon is, whatever of it still exists, is an underwater oasis. It literally was known to many in Indonesia as the Amazon under the sea. And it is beautiful. It had more biodiversity per square foot than anywhere else in that entire region, right? It was marvelous, it was important, and it was beautiful. And several years ago, I'm trying to remember the year, I have it in my notes there somewhere, a cruise ship. So this was not even people visiting and breaking off the coral like we see a lot of times. A cruise ship in the area, or that was allowed to enter the area because it was ironically bird watching and not even sea watching, ran aground and destroyed a significant percent of the reef system and the reef ball network. If that wasn't bad enough, the ship ran aground, and this was a giant cruise liner. So think the celebrity cruise ships or Carnival cruise ships, right? And then how do you get a ship like that that's run aground and stuck on coral, which is essentially rock? You hire a giant tugboat to rip it out. And then what happens when the tugboat enters, rips, pulls out the ship, rips. And so you have the degradation, severe degradation of something that when these tourists go home, it's Indonesian people who, for a lot of them, fisheries is their bread and butter and is their livelihood. Then that's damage for generations. Like we know here in Barbados, the cost of damaging our reefs and how many decades upon decades it takes to regenerate the reefs. When I was at school, I remember the coral reefs died and were dead in Carlisle Bay. And there was a reef ball project, oh my goodness, decades ago that was done, and they dropped balls into the ocean off of Carlisle Bay. Now people can actually go scuba diving because it's regenerating the coral reef. That is decades and decades of work that it takes to help nature out when we as humans kind of destroy it. So in conclusion, so there are a number of things that I think during the redevelopment process was done well. I think the government still having a hands on it and it not being just a random place owned by somebody named Mr. Harrison, and managing those lands and having monitoring be central to it, that was excellent. having community involvement. I think that was done really, really well. And engaging the local community and making sure they were seen and heard and were able to give their own feedback. Infrastructure enhancement to the surrounding community. They benefited from roads and a number of other things, economic opportunities, as the redevelopment project continued. And then, of course, some areas for improvement, because nobody is perfect. So some of the techniques used in the initial excavation are questionable now today, but context is everything, and they wouldn't have had the same machinery then. Unnecessary features which couldn't work in the terrain. So there was an area that was created prior to reopening that was supposed to be this cool woodland feature. So it was supposed to be this walkway that went through the gully, and it was supposed to be really, really cool. However, sometimes architects do things conceptually that seem really, really cool and don't consider what the natural environment is. So we had a situation where within weeks of reopening, it was completely covered in moss. It was a slip hazard. It just looked like it was sticking out. You had this lush landscape and then this giant thing just sticking out, like, no. And then, of course, striking a balance. That was always a juggling act, striking a balance between revenue generation and sustainability. And I think there's always going to be, not that it was done poorly, I don't think it was done poorly, but I always think there's room for improvement, right? None of us are perfect, and nothing we do is perfect. So there's always room now and in the future to think, okay, how can we do this better? How can we do that better? How can we protect the cave even more as we go on, even in the case of having it sublet now out into a third party that's not a Barbadian-owned company and all of that, making sure that they understand the ethos of striking that balance as well. So any comments or observations, any suggestions on something done well or done poorly? Or let's not say poorly, an area for improvement. Yes. Yes, Nick.
I have a question. You just mentioned third party, and I wanted to know, what are your thoughts and feelings towards them being the current management of the cave?
That's an interesting question. Let me see how I can say this diplomatically. It was a prospect that was explored a number of times. Let's say that. I was able to view, not from Chukka specifically, but from other persons who over the years wanted to have, the ability to manage the cave. Actually, at one point, Foster and Ince was vying for that job as well, where they wanted to be the ones to manage the cave for us, right? It's challenging for me because I love it, and partly because I'm truly ignorant to what they are and are not doing in terms of sustainability. But some of the changes that were made are, cute, aesthetic. But I'm not sure if some of the newer attractions are in line with the vibe of the original cave. So for example, I feel like now when you approach it, it feels very much like the name Chukka. It feels bright and vibrant when you see the areas where you can like walk over and the obstacle course and all of that. That feels to me like a kind of like a quasi amusement park with the pools and all that stuff, right? When you go into Harrison's Cave on that tour, it's a very different experience. It's a very different feel, So it's almost like you have two different attractions in one. And I don't know if that's good or bad. That's just how it feels to me. I guess the jury is out and is up to personal preference, what you prefer. I prefer keeping it as natural as possible. But again, like I said, the plans always included some of the things that they have implemented. And I think it's very expensive to manage a cave. So it's important to also earn money. So let's say that. But yeah, I don't have too much to say as it relates to Chukka. Like I said, I don't I haven't worked directly with them, but I do know that we had proposals from other companies similar to them that with my Barbadian hat on and not my tourism marketer hat on weren't great, you know? And that's kind of the line that I've struggled with in tourism. Am I a Barbadian today? Am I a tourism marketer today? Or am I a sustainable tourism champion today? And sometimes those can be conflicting hats.
The lines get very blurry.
Very, very, very blurry. But I think, I mean, what they have done in terms of enhancing the product, I think is good. I just, again, because of sheer ignorance in the sense that I don't know, I no longer know what they're doing. And a lot of the team that I hired or used to work with there have all been sent home and new people hired. So I truly, I'm not on the ground to kind of know exactly. And CBL as an entity, Case of Barbados Limited as an entity has been whittled down, I think, to maybe only like 2 persons. So I don't even know in terms of the sheer magnitude of management, like how much or how little they're doing based on whatever the contract is with Chukka. And we know government is notorious for having amazing contracts like the one with Pine Hill Dairy, right?
The reason I asked was because given the fact that we were talking about sustainability, I just did a quick Google
Yeah.
to see if I could see what their stance is on sustainability and managing the cave. And I couldn't find nothing. I didn't find anything with a quick Google just now.
Right.
So that's why
Interesting.
so it's interesting to see, interesting to hear
That's
what you
really
said, that you
interesting.
don't know their stance on it as well, given the role you have been in and you're currently in, to know what their stance is on sustainability, because they still have to follow the Caves Act.
Yeah.
But like you said,
One would think.
it's no a Chukka park, basically, because I've done
Yeah.
tours there now recently, and like you said, the branding is it's basically a Chukka brand now, and not
Yeah.
Harrison's Cave Barbadian attraction.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing. I mean, having traveled for cruise tourism conferences and stuff like that, and hearing, so there's a natural attraction, is it in St. Lucia? It's in one of our neighboring islands in the Eastern Caribbean. It's in Jamaica, the river rafting and river tubing in Jamaica and St. Lucia, I think. And just listening to some of those persons who either are from the country or manage the attraction, and their kind of love-hate balance with the sector, especially the cruise sector specifically, because with long stay visitors, you can kind of manage that a little better. But with cruise visitors, like you mentioned, you have this this huge group of people that descend on you simultaneously. It's always very difficult to juggle. And a tour operator's job, as you know, Nicholas, is very, very different from anyone else's job. Their job legally and mandated by these cruise ships is to move people around a destination as efficiently and without incident as possible and get as much money from them as possible, you know?
Very difficult to do.
Correct. And so if that is the tour company's mandate, I'm sure you can see how then you may have some friction. But again, like I said, I don't know for sure what their arrangement is. I no longer work or know many people that are still working within the organization. So I'm not sure. I do know in previous research with Chukka and other agencies, like you said, there's nothing there to find. So it would be good if some of these tour operators or tour companies would, at the very least, have a little blurb about what their stance or position is on it. But I tend to think that a lack of is also saying something, right? So we can say things without saying them. And I think having it would say something, and not having it also says something. And so that is it from me. If anybody has any more questions, you can let me know. Yes, go ahead. Are you speaking?
All right. No,
You're on mute.
I don't know who is speaking, but I'm not speaking. I was going to. I was waiting. Sometimes there is a delay on Zoom here. But anyway, Veronica, this was, thank you so much. This was really such a, like breath of fresh air. Very, very interesting and extremely informative. I always enjoy hearing from, practitioners, but in this case, it's not only practitioner. I thought I lost you there. You also have the background knowledge from having studied tourism. So I just found it really, really good. I hope the students enjoyed it too. But I guess, did you just ask them to give you comments, thoughts, questions, whatever? Yeah, so students, feel free, don't be shy. We know Nicholas is always participating. Thank you so much, Nicholas, so far. But anybody else? Questions, thoughts, comments, anything you have to say to Veronica? I know some are having Wi-Fi issues, so they may not want to speak because they might be breaking up. But anyhow, any other comments here? I'm not seeing any hands.
I have a question,
I'll go.
unrelated. Veronica, I just want to know if I could quote you on there are roads in the potholes and not potholes in the roads.
I love that one too.
I actually stole that from RPB, so I cannot take credit. That is a line in one of his songs from a million years ago. And so, yeah.
Yeah, that was really great. I see you put your email address there, Veronica, in the chat. Everyone. Yes.
In case anyone wants to reach out or you want to follow up on any of the information I shared, I can also follow up and share with Christina the links for the Caves Act and the journal article that I pulled some of the stats about cave attractions and their contribution to revenue. So I'll share those after along with the presentation and you guys can have a look.
Yeah, that will all be available on e-learning, as always, under the topic of this week. So Nicholas is clapping his hands there. Thanks, Nicholas. All right. Any other, any comments, I should say, other than the ones from Nicholas so far? Veronica is still here?
Yes.
Yes. All right. Well, I'm not seeing anything, Veronica. I learned a lot. I mean, thank you so much for sharing all that, the history there with the caves and, even going back to your family. I mean, I thought that was really super interesting and I enjoyed that. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Really. I mean, you definitely have to come back. We'll talk about that later.
It truly is my pleasure. Yeah, this program is important to me. I love tourism attractions.
Yeah, that's clear, very clear. It comes across when you talk about like today, very passionate and knowledgeable, of course. The topic. So it was very nice. It was a pleasure having you, Veronica. So if there are no questions or comments or anything else you have to say to Veronica at this point in time, then I'm going to say again, Veronica, thank you. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I will await the slides if you want to share them. And yes. And the documents, and I will share it with the students. Awesome. Thanks, Veronica.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. You too. Bye. Bye-bye. All right. You guys were an embarrassingly quiet bunch. Thanks, Nicholas, for engaging. So, any questions to me? Any comments? Anything you have to say? I am not seeing any signs of life here. All right. There was something I was going to talk to you all about. Yes. I'm just checking e-learning here. Because there was something here. Let me see. So, all right, so as you already know, today we had Veronica as our guest, and you have your quiz / exam, or whatever you want to call it. It opens at 12:30. And then next week, we're going to talk about heritage as tourism attractions. Harrison's Cave is part of Barbadian heritage. And so I'm not going to go too much into or at all Harrison's Cave next week, because Veronica did a great job at doing that. And then the following week, we're having the course summary, the review with your discussion, with any submitted discussion questions, that is. And you do have the last quiz there, the last 10% on the 23rd. So that is 2 weeks from now. What I might do is, if there are no, if you all don't send me any discussion questions for the course review, then I could throw in the course summary review after next week's lecture, I should say. And then on the 23rd, all you have to do is just log on for your quiz. So I'm leaving that again to you all. So if I can see, I need to see your hands now. So who wants me to do, instead of you having that discussion next week, we will do review, if there are any review questions. And if not, I'll just tell you how many questions in the final exam. You know, the usual, you've taken on my courses before, so you know how I do it. You want to do that? So I'm going to give you two options. Or and then on the 23rd, all you do is just log on to your quiz, and that's it. Who wants to do that? Raise your hand. Or maybe you don't want everybody to know. Do I have to create a poll here? No, I don't have to create a poll. I'm seeing some hands. Okay. And there is only, you keep them raised, guys, because you know how Zoom has this delay. So if those of you who want me to deliver next week's lecture, heritage attractions, and then finish off next week with the review, raise your hands. That means if I do that, then on the 23rd, we do not meet, you log on to your quiz, and that's it. If that's what you want, raise your hands. There's only 3 persons who don't want to do that. Okay. There's only 2 of you who don't want to do that. So all, okay. Keep your hand, well, you can all lower your hands, thank you. Nicholas, can you hear me?
Yeah.
You don't want to do that?
They may just have.
It's everybody against you, so I have to ask you.
Yeah, that's fine, but the reason I didn't raise my hand is because I might have some questions on authenticity.
Authenticity. Oh,
yeah.
Which you want me to cover in the review, you mean?
Yeah, if
Yeah,
possible.
so that's what I'm saying. I mean, I will do review no matter what. So really and truly, my question should have been, do you want me to do review at the end of next week or lecture? Or do you want me to do review the following week? And then you have
the review can happen after class next week.
All right, so that means everybody, there's only one person absent. And unfortunately, if you're not here, you don't get a vote. But it's the whole class against that individual in that case. Now, that means if I'm doing review next week, so Nicholas, if you have any, like you just said, you wanted me to clarify something about authenticity, submit those questions as soon as possible. I usually say a week, but I am suggesting this today. So if you guys can send those to me before the end of Sunday, this coming Sunday, so you have today, tomorrow, and the weekend to send me any questions you will have or that you may have for review. Yeah, I'm seeing somebody, yeah, Indica in the chat. Yeah, by the end of the week. So just send me those questions, but you need to be specific. Yeah, don't just say, can you talk more about authenticity? No, it has to be specific. Because if I talk more about authenticity, that's the whole lecture I covered on authenticity. I'm just using authenticity because, Nicholas, you mentioned that. All right. So whatever question you have, it has to be specific. Okay. So if you send me that before the end of Sunday, I will incorporate that into my review, and I will do that after next week's lecture. Like, it's part of next week's lecture. So I will cover heritage attractions, and then I'll review by answering some of your, well, not some, I will answer the questions that I receive. Yeah. And of course, if you have any questions on heritage that I'm covering next week, you know, make sure that you make notes of those during the lecture, and I will elaborate. I mean, as we normally do, I'll do it throughout the lecture as well, but make sure you ask your questions then. Aaron, you still have your hand raised. Is that from before, or do you have a question? Aaron. Maybe that's
sorry, Mom. It doesn't take it down. Sorry about that.
That's all right. No problem. Just checking. Okay, so all right. So that means that you still have the last quiz in 2 weeks. And it's 10%. So it's going to be whatever we have covered between the 2 quizzes. All right. I mean, I do sometimes throw in the basic knowledge questions that you ought to know. But yeah. So I'm going to stop the recording here because Veronica's presentation is over. So I guess they're going to have to trim it.